Jackson, are we ready? I guess we are. Okay, first of all, I'm David Rejebian. There you go. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time up here at the beginning because we're going to stay a little bit later tonight because we have a big evening. So I don't want anybody to get in a huge hurry to leave at 8 o'clock. Just hang tight and it's going to be fun. I'm going to introduce right now Arang Sistuli from the church to welcome us and pray, and then I'll be back to introduce Sharron.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Arang Sistuli. I am your serving coordinator, so if you want to volunteer here at the church or with our community, I would be the person that you would speak with. I am also the discipleship coordinator, and that is why I support Richard Sanford with this community. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Thank you, Lord, for calling on each of us to come here in fellowship. We know you are the supreme author, and we are your text. As we sit here, joining in your ever-constant collective communication you have with us, we ask that you quicken our hearts to acknowledge the amazing creativity and talent with which you communicate with us through writing and engagement. We thank you for bringing Sharron Lucky here and ready ourselves with grateful anticipation for what she will share with us tonight. As we each interpret and process what she conveys to us, may we remember that you had intended to create each of us to be a significant word in a far greater story of love. May we experience a portion of this love in fellowship during this hour. Thank you for this opportunity. In Jesus Christ's name I pray, amen.
Okay, now almost everybody here knows who is our speaker tonight, and I feel like I almost know her bio by heart because she's reviewed for us so many times over the last number of years. I won't say how many, but just to give you a little bit of insight, her bio says her stage career started in high school, so that had to be, 15, 20 years ago. So she's probably pretty new at this. But you all know how many times she's reviewed for us, how great the reviews have been. But maybe what you don't know is that she's written plays, and with her husband, Sharron Lucky, 25 LP albums for children, and it's pretty amazing. And I think back to last year, the review that she did, which was so good, and the one before that. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time. Oh, you know what? I'm just going to say one thing. You may think that it took a phone call from my mother to get me to wear pants and not shorts, but that's not it. And I'll explain more about that at the end of the review. So without further ado, Sharron Lucky.
Thank you. I think Bethia and I could have been good friends. We might have sat near each other in school because her last name was Mayfield, Bethia Mayfield, and my last name was Neufeld. Her father was a minister, so was mine. Her father came from England to minister to the heathen on Martha's Vineyard. My father came from a small Mennonite community in Nebraska, where I was born, to minister to the heathen in Oklahoma. And he didn't want to be a Mennonite minister. He wanted a holiness pulpit, fire and brimstone. So I grew up thinking that everybody who wasn't in our congregation was a heathen. That would have included Bethia and her family because they were Calvinists. I think Bethia would have understood why I wasn't like her other classmates, because I couldn't wear jeans or jewelry or makeup or go to movies or dance. Didn't even have a TV in our parsonage until it was almost time for me to leave home. She had her own restrictions, but I think she would have understood mine. We both had mothers who were sickly, which left us with household chores and the care of siblings. And for several years, I had a giant pear tree in my backyard. I could climb dangerously high for my age and hide among the peppery smelling blossoms. In season, I could just pluck a golden pear for a snack. Of course, she had the lovely forests and beautiful beaches of her unspoiled island before it became a tourist attraction. But there were a couple of things that separated us and just ruined our friendship. One was that she was born in the mid-1600s. I'm older than dirt, but I was born in the mid-1900s, so 300 years separated us. There was another thing. Bethia is a work of fiction, and I'm fairly real. I do have a shoulder replacement. It's plastic, but outside of that, I'm real. I will tell you that this past season, I had trouble finding a book. We'd gone through COVID and all kinds of stuff. I read good books, great books, classics, new books, and I couldn't fall in love with anything. And by April Fool's Day, I began to panic. So did the program chairman. You know who you are, who were calling me, wanted to do your book. I sat down in my office one day to have an epiphany. And I looked around at all the shelves of books in my office that I had loved. I don't throw away or give away the books I love. Do you? I even had a 1913 edition of the first book I loved, Little Women, up on my shelf. I'll tell you a little story about that. I read Little Women 5 times in the 3rd grade. And what was strange about that, I guess, was that I was only 7 in the 3rd grade. Because I skipped the 2nd grade. Now, that was really stupid in retrospect. It wasn't my idea. I've often thought that if I hadn't skipped 2nd grade, perhaps I would have been valedictorian of my class, or maybe gotten some more scholarships, you know. But my daddy came to talk to my 2nd grade teacher. Now, we had moved, had a new parsonage, had a new church, I had a new school, and I guess maybe because I could already read, he talked to my 2nd grade teacher, a lovely lady, and they walked me across the hall to the 3rd grade. Hostile territory. Everyone looked at me like I did not belong. I was too young. The teacher was mean. Now, the good thing about that move was this. Our church, our new church, was right across the street from the public library. So I could ride to work with my daddy on Saturdays or in the summers and go across the street and spend the whole morning in the library. I can remember how it smelled. I can remember that right around the corner from the front door was the Louisa May Alcott shelf. And I started at one end and read to the other end, circled back and read Little Women 5 times. It was my favorite. And that mean teacher in the third grade teacher. She stomped by my desk in her sensible shoes one day and said loud enough for everybody to turn and stare at me, "How many times have you read that book?" I thought I'd done something wrong. That it was bad to read a book over and over that you loved. Well, I started there, and I worked my way around the shelves of my own office and stopped when I came to Caleb's Crossing. This was a book I'd already read twice, and I had given it an A+ twice in my reading journal. And I'd gone on to read everything else that this Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times best-selling author had written. And the Pulitzer Prize, I think this is interesting, the Pulitzer Prize was for a book she wrote called March. And it was about the missing father of the little March women I'd loved so long ago. He was a chaplain in the Civil War in that book. And another irony was this. Jackson. I've got it up here, I'll show you. This was in the Dallas Morning News shortly after I picked this book, the latest book by this author called The Horse. Geraldine Brooks is a wonderful writer. And there it is. Can you see it? Did you read it? Raise your hand if you did. Oh, look at that. You did. Well, like her other books, The Horse is based on a real event. So is Caleb's Crossing. One single verifiable event just instilled a story in her. She added characters, dialogue, her beautiful alliterative language, her prose, I love it, and the horse is the same way. My husband grabbed it before I had a chance to read it. You liked it too, didn't you, dear? Yes. And so you guys would like it. It's about a real horse, Lexington. Well, I have a couple of things to tell you about this author. She doesn't write beach books. She doesn't write chick lit. These books are very seriously historical novels. And she lives on the island she writes so beautifully about. I don't think this thing's going to play with me, Jackson. There. It's Martha's Vineyard. She lives there with her family, and she writes about it so beautifully that I just immediately wanted to go be there. The other thing I want you to know right off the bat is that Caleb was real, and so was his crossing. But the book is narrated by my friend Bethia Mayfield, and I'm going to step aside and let her start with part 1. Here she is. The scripture says, "Their foot shall slide in due time. Lose one's footing as I did, and age matters not." Now, some would say that I was a child whom Satan the trickster toyed with. No, my sins were not mere nursery mischief. They were matters etched in stone. I broke the commandments day following day, and I did it willingly. Preacher's daughter, how could I? But like Eve, I thirsted after forbidden knowledge, and I ate forbidden fruit. Our neighbor, Goody Branch, was midwife for this island, and she sent me to fetch from her cottage next door some groaning beer to help ease my mother's childbed fever. When I returned, I listened outside the door to see what my mother was saying. She was talking about her own death. 3 days later, we buried her in the rock-hard ground that had not yet thawed. We tended a fire all night long so that we could dig her grave between the grave of my beloved twin brother Zuriel, who died of a tragic accident when we were 9, and an infant brother who hadn't lingered long enough on this earth for us to name him. It's been near a year since my mother's death, and since that time I've had the constant care of Solus, the baby sister born on that fateful day, and the keeping of this house. I bend under the chores I now have, mother's and mine both. At 15, I feel that I've taken on the burdens of a woman. I feel I've become one. I no longer have the freedom of my sinful days to just ride out into the leaf-dappled, loamy mornings and pluck sky blue berries that burst sweet and juicy in my mouth. I made this island mine, day following day. My grandfather, for reasons of his own, became magistrate of this island. And it's not him, but me, who loved it so much. I loved the mornings where the fog wrapped its milky veil around our heads. I loved the wind moaning and keening through the chimney piece at night. I loved the sound of my clogs in the ways through the woods, crunching. Every outcrop, every inlet of this island I loved. I had been taught early that nature is a foe to be subdued. But in stages, I came to worship it, the first of my false gods. And yes, I have besought the Lord. I have no sign that I'm saved. When my father had his first convert from the Wampanoag tribe, it was a rough-hewn outcast from his own people named Iacumas, and my father dared to invite him to come and dine with us. In so doing, he found a quick mind. He decided to ask this man to teach him the heathen language. I always listened to my father's lessons, so I soon found this man's language falling into my own mouth. It wasn't long at all until I had a number of phrases, sentences, words that I could speak and understand in Wampanoag. This confession that I'm writing must begin 3 years ago, in the lean summer of my 12th year. Clamming was a despised chore. So my brother Makepeace made sure it fell to me, claiming that the burdens of his studies, which my sister is not burdened with, as he said, kept him from doing clamming. He often shirked his duties, but I was never to ride out alone. That was one of my commandments. On the morning I'm telling you about, he would not go, and my aunt could not go. She was busy. I decided to commit my first sin of disobedience and ride out alone to parts unknown. And so as soon as I was out of sight of the house, I hitched up my skirt. I let my pony Speckles gallop as fast as she could. I just wanted to be gone and away and free. As usual, I had slipped one of Makepeace's Latin books into my basket, which was another sin of disobedience. My father thought it was undesirable for a young girl to be too much at books. My education ceased abruptly when my twin brother died because we were taught reading together. My father said if I wanted to read something, I should read the Bible. He said it was unseemly for a wife to know more than her husband. Wife? I said. I'm 12. But he went on to say that in England or the mainland, I could have a choice of educated men, but not on this island. Read the Bible, he said. He commended me to Proverbs 31, 10 through 31. 2 sins overmastered me, pride and anger. And I said, would you have it in Hebrew, Father? And I started to quote it in Hebrew, and I got another lecture. So, on this morning I speak of, it was bright, it was beautiful, and I let Speckles gallop clear to the south shore. I slipped off her back, just marveling at the myriads of plants there that Goody Branch had told me about and taught me how to use, but I hadn't found them before, so I walked head down for quite some time, just amazed, curious. And then I remembered we needed clams for the chowder. So I hitched my skirt even higher and waded out into the water, only to find that I had picked a very poor place. And I was about to quit it and find another when I felt eyes on me. And I turned to look and saw him for the first time, the boy we now call Caleb. He was standing in a thick stand of seagrass, a bow over one shoulder, and something, I don't know, maybe the expression on my face or my hasty unfurling of my skirt to protect my modesty was swimming around me in the water, amused him, and he smiled. He looked to be a youth of about my own age. 3 glossy feathers were stuck in a topknot on his long, thick, jetty hair, pulled back from his coppery face. And his smile was unguarded, his teeth fine and white. And I felt it was impossible to fear him or to look away. But I gathered up my soaking skirt. I headed for the shore. In my haste, I caught my toe on some eelgrass and went plunging into the water, spilling all the clams that I'd gathered and soaking my bodice and sleeves as well. In an instant, he was beside me, a hard brown grip on my forearm, and he pulled me up out of the water. In his own language, I told him to let go. And his hand dropped. He stood fixed to the spot. It was my turn to smile. I don't think it would have surprised him more had my horse addressed him. Pokwa he said, pointing to my empty basket, and I nodded. He beckoned me then to the seagrass from which he'd appeared. I had a choice to follow him or not. And I wish I could say it caused me more thought, struggle. But I was thinking, how great would it be to find a better place to clam? It would be the first of many times I followed that feathered head to find strawberries 2 inches round, blueberry bushes just dripping with berries in the summer, and crimson bogs of cranberries in the fall. He just walked through the woods like a young Adam, naming creation in his own language. At first, we made a great pretense that we had met entirely by chance. that our paths had crossed. How surprising. But he was always quick to tell me where he planned to hunt or fish next. And he had no trouble tracking me. So easy, he said. At first I followed this young boy for the delicacies that I took home in my basket. But I will put down before God and all of you that I grew to love the hours I spent with him. He started to fill the void in my heart, left by my twin brother's death. And he also felt like a brother to me. More so than Makepeace, whose only communication was to command or correct me. And there was this. That wild boy had an understanding of this island I loved. Everything that bloomed or swam or flew, he understood and explained everything. It wasn't very long before I forgot that he was half naked, sassafras scented, anointed with raccoon grease. He just became my very dearest friend. So I knew enough Wampanoag so that we could talk, had nice chats as we walked and explored. But he was weeks and weeks without telling me his name. That's a grave intimacy among their people. When he finally did reveal his name, it was Chishatiamak, and it meant hateful one. I couldn't understand the nuance of the naming well enough to appreciate it. He didn't exactly understand my name either. Bethia means servant. He certainly didn't understand about being a servant of God. So we were discussing this one day as we walked, and he stopped suddenly and looked me in the eyes and said, I will name you over in the Indian way. I will name you Storm Eyes, because your eyes are the color of a thunderhead. Well and good, I said, but I will rename you too, because to me you're not hateful. I will name you Caleb, after the companion of Moses in the wilderness, known for his skills of observation and his fearlessness. Who is Moses? He asked. One day he came upon me reading, in this way of just appearing out of a low dune or a thicket of grass. His thin deerskin shoes didn't even leave a footprint. In fact, I had taken from him some instruction about how to do that too, so I could sneak up on my brother when he was resting instead of doing his chores. He pointed to my book. Those snowshoe tracks, they speak to you? He asked. And I nodded and pointed to the word for deer, which he said looked nothing like a deer. It looked more like a snail. That gave me an idea. Maybe I could be the instructor for a change. So I read a sentence in English and translated it into his language. And then I felt my earth shift because he asked if he might have my book. I knew that the Indians would give you a bowl or a belt or a canoe or a spear and think nothing of it. But this wasn't my book to give. I borrowed it from my father. And then I had an idea. I could give him my catechism book. I knew it by heart. And I'd heard my father say, in that way, they are more Christ-like than we Christians. So I handed it over. That led me to tell him that his tribesman, Iokumus, and his son Joe were taking classes from my father. They already knew all their letters. And Joel was 2 years younger, I surmised, than Caleb even. And I got a disgusted snort from my friend. "They're nothing to me now since they found your God," he said. "They walk tall, say their one God is more powerful than our many, and foolish men listen. And yet you walk with me," I said. And I should have added, "As your father forbids you, so mine forbids me." I had been taught since early on that preaching was not woman's work. And yet, how could I turn my back on this soul, this son of a chief, a Pawa? I decided that I would just sin again. I said, and drew it in the wet sand. By the singing of the cider, Caleb had learned his letters with a speed I could not credit. And he already knew a sizable amount of English that he could read, understand, and speak without an accent. You know, he was very generous. I could not, however, accept the haunches of venison that he roasted and offered me to take home. How could I explain that? "Look what I found in the woods." One day, he walked out into the water to check his fish traps, came back with a fine bass writhing in his hands, and I heard him thank that fish for its life before dispatching it with a quick blow. I'd never heard of such a thing. And then he said we should eat it right then and there, and I said it wasn't mealtime. And he laughed at me. "I've heard the English need a bell to tell them when they're hungry," he said. We spoke most of the time. Our conversations were in English now. I'd walked with him for 3 years. He came one day and put my catechism book back in my hand and said, "After today, I will no longer walk with you. Do not look for me." This pronouncement stung me like a switch. My eyes welled up with tears. "Why are you crying?" he demanded. "I am not crying," I lied, and a tear let go and ran down my cheek. He looked at me gravely, and I looked away ashamed. I knew his people considered crying to be a sign of lapidary character. "This is no matter for tears," he said. It's my time to become a man." And he explained that his uncle, Taquamak, was the wizard for his tribe, and he was going to follow his uncle out into the deepest woods. "And there I will spend the long night's moon, the snow moon, and the hunger moon," he explained, "alone." I'd heard of this. It was a heathen practice. And I thought Caleb was to be my convert, my proof to my father that I deserved further education. No, that's a sinful thing, isn't it? Selfish. I just didn't want to be without my friend. That's selfish too. While Caleb shivered in the cold, I turned 15. My mother died. I became a woman. I heard my father one day tell my brother that he thought the second son of the miller that lived south of us on the swiftest brook on the island would make a good husband for me. "Noah marries a godly boy. He's a good, sturdy worker. He'd make a good husband for our Bethia." I'd sinned mightily, I knew, but was even this choice to be made for me? It's here I have to confess that the scraps of paper I steal from Makepeace's trash and write these notes on are not going to be adequate for my story. I hide them in the straw of my shakedown. I only can write late at night, and I'm sinning again. I have chores all day. It's after midnight of the Lord's day. I scribble these words. It's a sin. But how can I not when I need to tell you how it is and why that Caleb will be sleeping in my house this very night? I'll rush through it because you must know. While he was in exile, smallpox hit his tribe. My father took healing medicines and prayers, but Caleb's parents both died and many more of his tribe. Some of the Knob-Knocket band thought that the pox was the sign of God's power because none of the English missionaries became ill. When Caleb returned to find that maybe his exile had saved his life, he also realized he was the surviving son of the Pawa. He sought out my father to thank him for his mercies and to offer rewards from his people. In English, flawless English. My father couldn't believe it. He came home, he couldn't stop talking about this wise Indian youth and trying to figure out how on earth he had learned our tongue. I had to take a walk about. I was afraid I'd say something. My father almost immediately began to plan a course of study for this orphan and to invite this orphan to board with us so he could take classes with Iakumas and Joel. That is how, and that is why Caleb will be sleeping in the floor beneath mine this very night. And what do you think's going to become of me? Part 2. The Sabbath morning that Caleb came to be with us was bright and glistening. My father had fetched him the day before and taken him to my grandfather's house. I've already told you he was magistrate of this island, and I don't understand that legal terminology, but he was a distant and austere figure of my youth. But his manservant was tasked with bathing Caleb and grooming him for Sunday meeting. I went early to church, slipped into the women's section with Solus, looked constantly at the door. But I tell you, I would not have recognized Caleb when he walked through it. His elaborately dressed hair had been shorn. He was wearing a good doublet and gherkin from my grandfather's closet. And he marched down the aisle like the princeling he was among his own people. Some of the congregation stared, some of them glared. But my father was steadfast. And he was even in a merry mood as we walked the short distance to the parsonage where I had prepared our first dinner to share. I'd made a hearty chowder and cornbread with brown crust, and even taken out some dried fruit for the occasion. When I placed a bowl of huckleberries and hazels in front of Caleb, he looked up at me and smiled for the first time, knowing it was he who'd shown me where to find them. And I had to wonder, he'd changed so much since I'd taken a tearful goodbye of him in the woods. And I had to just wonder what all he'd given up to come and stay with us. Like the fine furs he slept on every night. Now he had our harsh straw shakedowns instead. The next morning, I rose early to draw the water from the well. I set the heavy bucket on the rim, and I saw Caleb coming from the low dunes by the shore. I bid him a good morning. The dawn was breaking fire behind him. And he answered civilly, taking a hand to my bucket. No need, I can manage it, I said. But he did not remove his hand. So I had to remove mine so as not to grapple with him. And then I'm searching for something to say. Why are you up so early? I said. I cannot remember a morning I did not sing a greeting to Kasokant upon his rising, he said. And I just stopped and stared at him. What is it, Storm Eyes? Did not God make the sun? May I not sing a hymn of praise upon that? We slept under the same roof now. I felt the distance between us was greater than it had ever been. He lingered after the meal to whisper the Latin words he'd just learned to himself. Now, his early attitude toward Iacumas and Joel had changed a great deal because that gentle giant of a boy went out of his way in subtle, diverse ways to let Caleb know that he was an ally, and they were both quick studies for my father. I had to prepare the meal while he sat there, so I set the table for our meal, and he kept watching my hands, and finally he said, ornate arrangements. In English, ornate arrangements. I couldn't get over the working of his mind. And then he looked up at me and said, I miss our lessons, Storm Eyes. One night at dinner, we were discussing it was about time for me to plant the garden. And Caleb said he wanted to help with that. My father said, well, now, planting is woman's work among the Wampanoag, isn't it? Yes, said Caleb, true, but I dine at your board. I'd like to help put the food upon it. So we planted the garden together. He taught me how. You take the ground just as it is and make a mound, digging in sea-wrack with your fingers, and then you plant a herring in each one. And then when it's warm enough, you put a corn kernel in each mound, and when it sprouts, you plant bean seeds all around. They can climb that corn stalk. No need for arrows. When it was warmer still, the ground that was still bare, we put squash seeds there. The tendrils reached out, choked out unwanted growth. Now, some of our neighbors raised their eyebrows, but one who didn't was the young farmer Noah Mary. Remember him? Designated husband. He came and walked our gardens and planted his the same way. I can barely lift pen to paper to tell you the next chapter. I weep as I write it. When that harvest came in, I awakened one morning to go pick squash and beans in first light, as I like to do. And I slipped out of the shakedown very quietly so as not to awaken Solus. And when I saw the others were up and reading, I went to see to her. The bed was empty. I interrupted my father to ask him where she might be, and he just looked startled. In the next instant, Caleb and Makepeace were on their feet. We were all calling her name, and Caleb went straight to the spot and found her face down in 3 feet of water in a shallow hole where we'd been digging a new well. He grabbed up her limp, muddy body and ran with her to my father's outstretched arms. I knew she'd come to find me, and I could see the raindrops sluicing through her silky hair, falling from her hem. It looked in the sunlight like gems angels were flinging in her path, the path of her ascending soul. And I'm not going to linger here with our grief. I must hurry through it for your sake and for mine. It's not over yet, for one thing. It was quite some time later, but my father decided he needed to go to England to ask for more money for his mission. By this time, he had a goodly number of converts who came to his last sermon and to bid him Godspeed. A fortnight later, we got news that his ship had gone down in a storm. Death by water is an abiding fear among island-dwelling people. To lose two such beloved souls to that fate was my breaking point. I still awaken in the night hearing that sweet sister's cry, and I startle awake only to find aching loneliness. To make matters worse, my grandfather summoned Makepeace and me to the reading of the will he'd drawn up with my father before he left. It was no surprise to me that the house, the land, belongings all would go to Makepeace. I could live there until I married. What did surprise me was that there was no money set aside to send Makepeace to college at Cambridge. And grandfather was quick to say he wasn't going to provide the funds, and every cent we had gone to the bottom of the ocean with my father. Makepeace jumped to his feet. I'm to be a minister. That's all I've ever wanted. Grandfather, you cannot. And unexpectedly, grandfather's gaze shifted to me. If Bethia will agree to be indentured to the headmaster, Mr. Corlett, that will pay your school fees. And Bethia, it will give you a place to stay. You're not 17 till the fall and too young to marry. I was speechless. My father's death had left me rudderless. Was this to be my destiny? And yet, Caleb and Joel were going to enter the prep school for Harvard in the fall, due to a grant from an English group that wanted to Americanize Indians. So we'd all be there together. So it was decided. Part 3. Once again, I'm woefully behind in this story. I will try to fill in the blanks, but it's been months since I've written. One thing I have aplenty now, though, is paper. Because when I clean the headmaster's chambers, I may help myself to any discards, pens as well, and thus provided I will try to fill in the blanks of my story. Cambridge is an unlovely town. Tiny houses built close together. A factory robs the peace. The roads are too rough for carriages. The townsfolk do not trouble themselves where they tip their slops. So the air reeks. The creek is brackish. Even if it weren't, it wouldn't be wholesome because the town uses it for a drain. And my chores here are monumentally more than the ones I had at home. This morning I lifted the water from the well, looked down at a frowning, drab, gaunt face. I didn't even recognize myself. The headmaster does not want to waste wood to warm water. The lads have to crack the ice in troughs outside to wash up in the morning. And of my many other chores, I am tasked with washing all the laundry for all the students. Bedclothes, sheets threadbare, mending as I go. The one who complains the most about all of this is my brother Makepeace. He's by 2 years older than the oldest of the other students and by far the least qualified. He does, however, have the opportunity, the freedom to go back to the island whenever he wants to. Caleb and Joel have not the means. I'm bound here by my duties. And it just galls me when the headmaster talks about how uncommonly fortunate these Indian lads are to be at this elite school. He has no idea what they left behind, their peaceful, fragrant island. They seem determined, though, to tend to their studies and to, I guess, fulfill my father's dream for them to bring their people out of darkness. But I will say the white, rich students will never speak to them. I'm glad Caleb and Joel have each other. And you know, Caleb was lean, always outdoorsy, kind of lean, but I've watched him grow pitifully thin. Even losing the luster of his skin, he's become pale. Because of indoor life and the paltry diet. You know, he once dined on fresh fish, fresh venison, vegetables, nuts, fruit. Not here. And the rich students have families who bring in food and they share it with their white classmates. It's really sad to watch. And so my life just is going by in a dull blur. It got chilly. I guess I turned 17 along in there. No one took notice of it, least of all me. But I do want to tell you of a bright spot. Samuel Corlett. He's the son of the headmaster and teaches anatomy, tutors the students in anatomy. He's tall and dark, and like his father, must take after the mother whose place I'm trying to take. He's not a handsome man, plain, 26 already, and at some point he's broken his nose. It's given him the cast of a ruffian instead of a refined scholar. But he has these deep-set, dark, almost black eyes, and it makes him look interested. I often find those eyes fixed on me when there's a chance encounter. Everyone who knew my brother, Makepeace, could see that he was in over his head and falling further and further behind. He pulled me aside one day, and he said, "I cannot take it anymore. I thought on the island with Father alone that my qualities were sufficient, but I will no longer be reduced. Caleb and Joel are going to matriculate to Harvard with flying colors. I'll be left behind again, and everyone who knows me will pity me, say, Makepeace Mayfield is more stupid than a savage." Oh, you cannot take it anymore. My tone was mocking, insolent. You cannot take it anymore. You're a man, Makepeace, with all the rights and privileges of that title. Have you ever troubled yourself for a moment to wonder how much I would like to be home? But I am chained here for 3.5 more years on your behalf. This is a confession, so I will confess that I used a profanity, which gave my male superior, my brother, permission to beat me. That's our way. He also reported me to the authorities, who insisted that I give public confession at Sunday meeting. I had to lie a lot to try to be sorry. It was really sometime later that Samuel Corlett told me I was eloquent on that occasion. But it was humiliating, and the wounds my brother happily inflicted on my back would not heal. I couldn't reach them. I didn't have any salve. They seeped through my dress. They festered, and Caleb passed me in the hall. "I will see to your brother." Makepeace got very sick very soon, for a very long time, delaying his trip back to the island. But I did have a hero at this part of my story, Noah Mary. Remember him? chosen husband. He came to Cambridge to walk with me and talk with me, and I was really surprised. It was awkward. And he finally blurted out that he had been courting and was handfasted to a young woman on the island. He did not look at me. He did not see the relief on my face. And then he handed me a document like this, told me that his prosperous farm had allowed him, with an agreement with my grandfather, to pay my brother's school fees, and I was free. I was free. To do what? Go home with my brother? I found out that the couple that ran the buttery, where the students took their meals, needed help in the kitchen, and it would provide me with a paltry salary and room and board. The main thing I learned was that when the hatch was open to serve the meals, I could hear the students discussing their classes. And when it was closed, the dining hall became a lecture hall. And through the paper-thin walls, I could continue my education. As I was taking my leave of the servitude and abode of the headmaster, he mentioned again the interest of his son. This was the probationary fellow that I'd seen so many times cape billowing or striding across the campus. When he would catch my eye, he would smile. His teeth were as crooked as his nose. But the effect wasn't unpleasant. In fact, I have fantasized about being married to such a man who might elicit my ideas. And over the months and years of companionship, you could probably steal learning from such a man. So I looked down and fiddled with my cuff. I think this is whatever. I was just tongue-tied, me. I finally took a breath. I would be pleased to receive your son, Samuel. Part 4. I'm going to take the narrative away from my friend Bethia because she didn't finish this story until she was an old woman about my age. So in the interest of time, I will tell you that that was a very dear love story. Passionate even at times, if you like that. And it just was a great feat of this author, I think, to be realistic as well, because Samuel Corlett would find that if you marry a independent woman with ideas of her own, she could possibly be stubborn. And her ideas might not mesh with his. She would find that marrying a professor would mean that you needed some patience and might have to wait around for him to finish his schooling. You might have to follow him around the country as he followed his profession. And you might find that, farmers sometimes make more money than professors. I know this how, because I married a professor too. Even in this, Bethy and I are similar. But she is right. You can steal learning from such a man, and I have. It's a blessing. My husband and I are going to have our 61st anniversary in a few weeks. And I've stolen learning from him, and some of you may know that he has been my rock of late especially. And so, good for her. She married a professor as well. And I like the ending too, because they end up in Martha's Vineyard again, finally, filling her heart with joy. Their only son loves it there. And even Dr. Corlett found a way to use his anatomy skills and provide medical attention for the citizens of Martha's Vineyard. Now, what's true about this story? The Wampanoag tribe existed on Martha's Vineyard for 5,000 years before the English missionaries came. The College of Newtown, which became Harvard, was established in 1636. That was only 6 years after the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established. In the 17th century, there were only 465 graduates of that elite school. Caleb Chishatiamak was one of them. How he became Caleb and how he learned English remains a mystery. The same is true of Joel Iacumas. He also was real and destined to be the valedictorian of the class of 1665. For reasons not the ones in the book, those are fictional, for reasons unknown, he went back to Martha's Vineyard before graduation. And returning for that ceremony, he ran aground, his boat ran aground on Nantucket. It was entered by marauders who murdered everybody aboard, including him. I don't know if his honor was mentioned at that graduation. I'm quite sure that Caleb marched like the princeling he would have been among his own people with his white classmates. He had astounded his professors with his knowledge of English, Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. This is a letter he wrote, it's in Latin, thanking his benefactors back in England for the privilege of his education. In this letter, he mentions Greek mythology, ancient philosophers, and even Christian ideology. Sadly, he died 1 year later of consumption. We call it tuberculosis. He weathered 3 months alone in the deepest, darkest part of the island, but 4 years at Harvard. You have to wonder. Today, his portrait hangs on the wall of Annenberg Hall on the Harvard campus. I wish he could know that in 2011, the female president of Harvard, Dr. Drew Gilpin Faust, handed a diploma to Tiffany Smalley, the first Wampanoag Indian to graduate from Harvard since Caleb. In that same ceremony, she also posthumously awarded a diploma to Joel Iacumas 346 years after he'd earned it. My friends, I've shared with you one of my favorite books tonight, and I have a challenge for you. I want to challenge you to go home and look on your own shelves and pick a book you've read before and read it again. Read it slowly. Mark it up, it's your book. No one's going to tell on you. Then go back through and pay attention to what you paid attention to. You might find a friend there. Don't we all need new friends? I was 3 times through this book before I realized how similar Bethia and I were. She became a dear friend during this season. And she began her story with a scripture, you remember. I'll end with one as well. Let's go back to Proverbs 17:17. A friend loveth at all times. At all times. So we can do that. Usually I end here, but tonight I'm going to add a little postscript. Some of you know that I'm forced to retire due to health issues. I've had a succession of things in the last few months that have made it imperative for me to leave this profession that I love. And I wanted to come tonight so I could thank you for being here tonight, for inviting me into your homes, your hearts, your clubs so often. And I wanted to thank my family for their support. Some are here tonight. My son, his lovely wife are here on the front row. My two sisters are here. I think my daughter and grandson, whose birthday is today, are here, and my only granddaughter. And especially my husband, who says that he's my biggest fan, and I'm certainly his. And he's been with me through all of this, driven me to some of my reviews, though I've had to cancel 6 reviews for the first time in my 22-year career. Broke my heart. He's also driven me to countless doctor's appointments and even to the ER at 2 a.m. So he's a hero. But mainly tonight I want to say thank you to David Rejebian, the family, Rejebian family, the committee, and Richard Stanford for allowing me to pay homage to Hermance Rejebian on numerous occasions. She started it all. What a grand and great gift she left for this literary community and beyond. I can't thank you enough. It's been such a privilege. And to my fellow reviewers, good lucky, as we say in our family. Carry it on. I will miss you. I do have my marching orders. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Goodbye. Yeah.
All right, you're not going to get off that easy. I got more notes. First, we have a bunch of reviewers here, or a few reviewers here that have reviewed for us over the years. I want them all to come up. I know there's Beth, who I called Dottie last week. Nella Phillips, Nancy Ashley, Dana Harkey. I don't know if I'm, Rebecca Blackwood. And I was making a list. I think I said before, I've been doing this
So lovely.
almost as long as Sharron has. And I started thinking about people we've had in addition to this great group. And there was, as she said, there was this gal named Hermance. And then I started thinking there was, some of you all remember, Gloria Hocking and Marjorie Curry and Joy Davis and Jimmy Kennedy and Karen Blair. This group up here, Susan Boone, Colleen Boudreau, Kathleen Cunningham. And then we had people like Dave Tanner. Remember Dave Tanner? And we had a guy that did a review about the circus one time in the old building. We had a guy that sang songs of Neil Diamond one night, and that might have been the biggest crowd we ever had for some reason. Then there was the night we had a lady that did a review that lasted 20 minutes. And all of a sudden, she was just done. And this was in the days when Max Hibbs was the head of the committee, and I looked at Max and, what do we do now? And I don't know what we did. She didn't want to take any questions, so we winged it. We had Mark Creditor, who was a singer, when we were in the sanctuary, and a big thunderstorm came one night. We all had to go to the basement, and so there was no program. But the point is, through all these years, I could always count on, when we would meet the first Tuesday in February, that there would be this, the review sandwich. And for years, the top bread was laurel and Moro, and the bottom bread, of course, was rosemary. And we always had this great meat and cheese and tomatoes in the middle of it. And then Lurlin retired, and it broke my heart. And of course, Rosemary retired, and it broke our funny bone. And then I was thinking tonight, and now Sharron's retiring. And what's that do? And then I thought about it, and I thought, wait a minute, I'm looking at this the wrong way. And I thought, how fortunate have we been this last 22 years to have you every year, knowing that we could plug you in. And then I thought fortunate's not even the right word. The right word is right in front of us, lucky. We have been so lucky. So thank you. And I know that even though you may not be up here reviewing, although if you decide, Jackson, if put this picture, I think I did this last year, but if that guy still is hanging on, you can always decide that the first Tuesday in February, well, maybe I'll be part of that sandwich again. Thank you so much. We've had such a great 20 years having you. And we know next year you'll be in the audience watching all these great people.
All these, yes.
And I'm going to let Richard say something really quick to Sharron and then tell you about next week.
And we know Sharron is a reviewer, but she's a children's author, she's a poet, and so our gift to Sharron is Trumpet and Drum, 1892, first edition, by America's poet of childhood, Eugene Field, inscribed with a Lincoln and nod. And so you can add that to your Beatrix Potter, and with our thanks, it's been a special 20 years.
Appreciate it.
And next week, wild thing, the joy of reading children's literature as an adult. Dana Harkey's going to bring that to us. So see you next week. And feel free to come forward and congratulate Sharron and all our reviewers. Thank you very much.